Welcome to Reveal Fears. Subscribe and like this video.
Part 1. A Scrawled Oath. Detective Mallory Cain stood in the center of the room, the amber glow of her flashlight catching on the peeling wallpaper. The air was thick with mildew and the sharp tang of something metallic, like blood, but older, more rusted. The house had been condemned for years, and no one was supposed to be here. Yet here she was, kneeling in what used to be a child's bedroom, staring at a message scrawled across the floor in a dark, flaking substance. "When it's time, we'll all be ready. Blood binds us." Her gloved fingers traced over the cracked wood surrounding the letters. It was sticky, but the black-red substance wasn't fresh. It reminded her of something ancient, as if the message had been waiting for her. The case that had led her here started as routine, a missing child, 7-year-old Mia Rogers. But things had spiraled quickly. Mia's parents were frantic, reporting strange noises and vandalized objects left on their porch in the days before her disappearance. And now, there was this, a sinister connection to the abandoned house on the edge of town. Something wasn't right. The handwriting was juvenile, but the tone was chillingly adult. The room's sparse contents, a broken rocking horse, a cracked mirror leaning against the wall, offered no further explanation, only an oppressive silence that seemed to thrum with its own pulse. Mallory pulled out her camera, snapping a picture of the message. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her. "Cain," she answered, her voice clipped. "Detective, you're not going to believe this," said Officer Green on the other end. "We just picked up someone near the Rogers home, Mia's schoolteacher, Mr. Hensley. He's saying some weird things about rituals." Mallory glanced at the message again, her stomach nodding. "Bring him in," she ordered. "And lock the room down. No one else steps foot in here until I say." As the call ended, Mallory pocketed her phone and took one last look around. Outside, the skeletal branches of trees scraped against the windows like claws. She had the sinking feeling that whatever was happening, it was only beginning. Part 2. The Stench of Secrets. The house seemed to breathe around her as Mallory ascended the creaking staircase. Each step groaned in protest, the sound amplified by the unnatural stillness. She had no idea what she was looking for, but the message downstairs demanded answers. She reached the second floor, her flashlight slicing through the gloom. A faint, sour odor drifted toward her, like decaying fruit mixed with the acrid bite of ammonia. It was stronger here. Mallory followed the smell to a door at the end of the hall, slightly ajar, revealing the edges of peeling black paint. Her hand hovered over the knob. She hesitated. The air beyond the door didn't feel right. She pushed it open with the tip of her boot. The beam of her flashlight illuminated a small bathroom. The source of the stench hit her immediately, a pile of soaked, rotting fabric in the bathtub. Mallory stepped closer, her instincts prickling as she realized the fabric was patterned with cartoon animals. Child-sized pajamas. Mallory's breath caught as she noticed what was beneath the fabric, a battered, blackened teddy bear, its fur matted and torn. It had been carefully arranged, its button eyes staring directly at her. Around its neck was a ribbon tied into a perfect bow. Scrawled on the tile above the tub, written in the same dark substance as the message downstairs, were 3 words. "Catch us first." Her phone buzzed again, nearly making her drop it. She fumbled to answer. "Cain," she barked, still staring at the haunting tableau. "Detective," said Green, his voice shaking. "You're going to want to hear this. Hensley, he's saying the Rogers girl isn't the only one. He's talking about 5 chosen." Mallory's pulse quickened. "Where's Mia?" she demanded. Green's response was a whisper. "He says she's with the others." Mallory stared at the teddy bear, the smell of decay overwhelming her. There was no doubt now, the case wasn't just about Mia Rogers. There were more victims. And someone, or something, was daring her to find them. Part 3. The List. Mallory wasted no time leaving the bathroom, her mind racing. She had to get out of the house. It wasn't fear, it was urgency. Her gut told her this place wasn't done with her yet, but she needed to regroup before it pulled her any deeper. Descending the stairs, she froze halfway down. There was a sound. Faint. Wet. A dragging noise, like fabric soaked in water being pulled across the floor. Her flashlight swept across the room below. Nothing moved, but the sound persisted, emanating from the direction of the front door. It was louder now, accompanied by a faint whisper she couldn't quite catch. "Who's there?" she called, her voice steady but low. The whisper stopped. Mallory reached the bottom of the staircase, gun drawn, her flashlight casting long, nervous shadows. The door was shut, the lock intact. But when she turned, her blood ran cold. The message on the floor had changed. Where it once read, "Blood binds us," the scrawl now said, "They're closer than you think." "What the hell?" she muttered. Her phone buzzed again, jolting her. She swiped to answer. "Green?" "No. It's Sarah," said her captain's voice, tight and concerned. "I just got a call from dispatch. There's something you need to see, it's on your desk at the precinct." "I'm in the middle of something," Mallory shot back, glancing at the altered message on the floor. "You need to come back," Sarah interrupted. "Now." Something in her tone sent a chill through Mallory. She gave one last look at the dark house before stepping outside, gulping in fresh air to cleanse the stench from her lungs. At the precinct, she found a small, unmarked envelope waiting for her. Its paper was rough, flecked with dirt. Inside was a single sheet of lined notebook paper, folded into quarters. She opened it carefully. The page held 5 names, written in the same shaky, juvenile handwriting as the messages in the house. Mia Rogers. Jacob Marner. Kaylee Tan. Isaac Pierce. Jenny Alvarez. Mallory's heart sank. She recognized 3 of the names immediately. Other children reported missing in recent months. Pinned to the bottom of the page was a Polaroid. It showed a dark, damp room lined with shelves. On the shelves were small objects, shoes, backpacks, toys. In the corner of the photograph was a single word scrawled in marker. "Soon." Mallory stared at the photo, her fingers trembling. The page felt heavier than paper had any right to. The phone on her desk rang, a sharp blare that shattered her focus. She snatched it up. "Detective Cain." Cain Green's voice, raw and barely controlled. "We just found Isaac Pierce." Mallory's stomach lurched. "Alive?" she asked, holding her breath. "No," Green replied, his voice cracking. "But that's not the worst part." Part 4: The Witness. Mallory arrived at the scene within 20 minutes, her tires screeching as she pulled up to the perimeter of yellow tape. It was a playground, a desolate one, its swings twisting aimlessly in the winter wind. The floodlights set up by the team illuminated the surrounding trees, casting elongated, restless shadows. Isaac Pierce had been found inside the tunnel slide, his body crumpled at the bottom like a discarded doll. Green met Mallory halfway, his face pale under the harsh light. "Where is he?" she asked briskly, though she dreaded the answer. Green hesitated. "We've secured the scene. But there's something you need to see before you get to the body." Mallory followed him toward the playground, her boots crunching over the frozen earth. She expected the worst, but when Green stopped at the base of the slide, her throat went dry. Etched into the frost on the slide's metal surface were the words, "They're watching you." "Jesus," Mallory whispered, tracing the letters with her gloved hand. She glanced up, scanning the surrounding area. "No footprints." "None," Green confirmed, shaking his head. "Whatever did this wasn't walking." Mallory stepped closer to the slide, peering into its dark mouth. At the bottom, Isaac's lifeless body was curled in an almost fetal position, his small hands clasped around a tattered piece of paper. Blood had seeped from the corners of his mouth, staining his pale cheeks. She crouched beside him, her hand trembling as she gently pried the paper free. It was another list, this time handwritten in crayon, the words barely legible. The names were the same as on the note from her desk. But this time, one had been crossed out. Mia Rogers. Jacob Marner. Kaylee Tan. Isaac Pierce X. Jenny Alvarez. Mallory's gut tightened as she stared at the tiny, scrawled X. There's more, Green said, drawing her attention away. What? We found a witness. The girl couldn't have been older than 6. She was wrapped in a thin, oversized coat, shivering despite the space heater placed near her chair in the back of an ambulance. Her face was streaked with grime, her hair matted and damp. She was hiding in the bushes, Green explained quietly. Her name's Rebecca. She won't talk to any of us. Maybe you can get something out of her. Mallory knelt in front of Rebecca, trying not to startle her. The girl's wide eyes flicked to Mallory's badge, then quickly back to the ground. Hey, Rebecca, Mallory said gently. I'm Detective Mallory. I'm here to help you. The girl didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the dirt smudging her small sneakers. Can you tell me what you saw tonight? Mallory pressed. Anything at all? Rebecca's lips quivered, but she didn't answer. Instead, she reached into the oversized coat, pulling out something clutched tightly in her hand. She extended it toward Mallory, her fingers trembling. Mallory carefully took the object, a small plastic ring, shaped like a butterfly. It was sticky with something faintly red. Is this yours? Mallory asked. Rebecca shook her head slowly, her lips finally parting to whisper a single word. Mia. Mallory's blood went cold. Part 5: The Tunnel. Rebecca was taken to the hospital for evaluation, but her whispered clue left Mallory with a grim determination. Mia Rogers was still out there, and the butterfly ring was the first tangible link to her since she disappeared. Time was running out. Back at the precinct, Mallory examined the Polaroid from earlier. The dark, damp room in the image haunted her. Shelves filled with small belongings, child-sized shoes, stuffed animals, backpacks. Somewhere, this room was waiting, its silence full of screams that had already been stolen. Her phone buzzed, breaking the quiet. Detective Cain, she answered. It's Green. We found something else, he said, his voice tense. It's at the playground. You need to see this for yourself. Mallory arrived to find Green and a few officers clustered near the swing set, their flashlights pointed at the ground. The frost had thickened in the cold night air, sparkling under the beams. What is it? Mallory asked. Wordlessly, Green stepped aside. The frost had been disturbed, leaving behind a trail of dark, sticky streaks, drag marks leading into the woods. Something, or someone, had been moved. It goes deep, Green said. We followed it about 50 yards before we hit something. What did you hit? A tunnel, he said grimly. An old storm drain, maybe. It's not on any of the city's current maps. Mallory didn't wait for further explanation. She grabbed a flashlight and motioned for Green to follow. The trail was unmistakable, winding through the trees like a sinister vein, until it led to a concrete opening barely wide enough to crawl through. The air that seeped from the tunnel was heavy and foul, reeking of stagnant water and decay. Mallory crouched at the entrance, her flashlight cutting into the darkness. The beam barely penetrated, swallowed by shadows that seemed unnaturally thick. I'm going in, she said, her voice resolute. Detective, are you sure? I'm not leaving a kid in there. The tunnel walls were damp and slick, forcing Mallory to crawl on her hands and knees. The farther she went, the more oppressive the darkness became, as if the weight of the earth above was pressing down on her chest. She followed the drag marks, her flashlight tracing the grooves etched into the dirt floor. The silence was unbearable, broken only by the faint drip of water and her own shallow breaths. Then she heard it. A faint rustling. Mallory froze, her light snapping toward the source of the sound. Something moved just beyond her beam, a quick, jerky motion that vanished as soon as it appeared. Hello? She called, her voice echoing eerily. The rustling stopped. Then, a whisper. A child's voice. Help me! Mallory's heart thudded painfully as she scrambled forward, her flashlight shaking. The tunnel opened into a small chamber, and what she saw made her blood turn to ice. 4 small chairs sat in a circle, each one holding a tattered stuffed animal. A dim lantern hung from the ceiling, casting weak, flickering light over the room. And in the corner, crouched and trembling, was a figure, a child. "Mia?" Mallory whispered, crawling closer. The child turned toward her, and Mallory's flashlight caught the face. It wasn't Mia. It was a boy, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken with terror. He clutched a stuffed rabbit to his chest, his lips trembling as he muttered something over and over. "They're coming," he whispered. "They're coming." Mallory's flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering weakly before plunging her into complete darkness. And then, she heard the rustling again. From behind her. Part 6: The Boy. Mallory's breath hitched in the suffocating darkness. She spun around, her flashlight refusing to flicker back to life. Behind her, the rustling grew louder, closer, like something dragging itself through the tunnel. "Stay quiet," she whispered to the boy, her voice trembling but firm. He whimpered, clutching the stuffed rabbit tighter. Mallory reached out, her gloved hand brushing his thin shoulder. "Hold on to me," she said, her fingers finding his icy hand and gripping it tightly. "We're getting out of here." The boy didn't respond, but she felt his trembling body press against hers as she led him toward the tunnel entrance. Every step was slow, every sound amplified in the oppressive silence. Her free hand groped the wall, guiding them forward. "Do you know your name?" Mallory asked gently, keeping her voice low to calm him, and herself. Jacob," the boy stammered. Her heart clenched. Jacob Marner. Another child from the list. "You're safe now, Jacob," she assured him, though her own fear gnawed at the edges of her words. They hadn't gone far when the rustling stopped abruptly. The silence was so sudden, so complete, that Mallory's ears rang. She stopped, gripping Jacob's hand tighter. "Detective?" the boy whispered, his voice cracking. "Shh," she murmured, her other hand reaching for her sidearm. The silence stretched, long and unnatural. Then came a sound that made her blood run cold, a faint, wet giggle. "Run!" Mallory whispered, pulling Jacob forward. They burst from the tunnel into the freezing night air, Mallory half dragging Jacob as they scrambled toward the lights of the crime scene. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her flashlight swinging uselessly in her other hand. "Help!" she shouted, her voice tearing through the night. Officers turned toward her, rushing to meet them. Green was the first to reach her, grabbing her by the shoulders as she collapsed to her knees with Jacob. "Jesus, what happened?" Green demanded, his eyes darting toward the dark mouth of the tunnel. "Get him to a medic," Mallory gasped, pushing Jacob toward him. "Now." An EMT swept Jacob into their arms, carrying him to the waiting ambulance. Mallory stayed on her knees, her hands shaking as she stared at the tunnel. "Did you find Mia?" Green asked, crouching beside her. Mallory shook her head. "No, but she's alive. I know she is." Her voice broke, and she clenched her fists, swallowing the wave of emotion rising in her chest. She had found Jacob, one child spared from whatever nightmare awaited in the shadows. But there were still others. "You should see this," Green said, his voice softer now. Mallory looked up as Green handed her a crumpled piece of paper. Jacob had been clutching it when they pulled him into the ambulance. It was a drawing. Crude and childlike, but unmistakable. 5 stick figures stood in a line, their arms joined. Above them, a dark shape loomed, a figure with unnaturally long arms, its head a hollow circle. Jacob had written something beneath it in shaky, uneven letters. "It picks us." Mallory's throat tightened as tears stung her eyes. She shoved the paper into her coat pocket and stood, forcing herself to focus. "They're still in there," she said, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. "Mia. Kaylee. Jenny. We have to go back." Part 7: The Circle. Mallory stood at the edge of the tunnel, flanked by Green and a team of officers. Their flashlights cut weak beams into the mouth of the opening, but none of them seemed eager to enter. "Detective, are you sure about this?" Green asked, gripping his flashlight tightly. "After what you saw in there." "I'm sure," Mallory cut him off. Her voice was firm, but her heart felt like a drumbeat of dread in her chest. Mia, Kaylee, and Jenny could still be alive. We're not leaving them behind. She stepped into the tunnel without waiting for further protest, her flashlight slicing through the damp darkness. Behind her, Green muttered a curse but followed. The air was colder now, the stench of rot thicker, more invasive. Mallory led the way, retracing her path to the small chamber where she had found Jacob. Her fingers tightened on her gun, her other hand gripping the flashlight like a lifeline. The chamber was still as she had left it, the 4 chairs, the stuffed animals, and the dim lantern casting trembling shadows across the walls. But something had changed. There was a new addition. A small, battered doll sat in the middle of the circle, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. A piece of string was tied around its neck, and beneath it, a 5th chair now stood empty, waiting. Mallory's throat tightened as she moved closer, her flashlight catching something carved into the floor beneath the chairs. It was a crudely etched symbol, a hollow circle with 5 jagged lines radiating outward, like broken sunbeams. "What is that?" Green whispered behind her, his voice hushed with fear. Mallory knelt, tracing the lines with her gloved fingers. The etching felt old, the grooves deep and deliberate. It wasn't random. This was planned. Ritualistic. This wasn't about one child, Mallory murmured. It was about all of them. Someone, or something, is choosing them. Her flashlight flickered, the beam dimming. The faint sound of footsteps echoed from the tunnel behind them. Green spun around, his gun drawn. "Who's there?" The footsteps stopped. "Hello?" Green called, his voice trembling. Mallory's flashlight flickered again before cutting out completely. She cursed, smacking the casing with her palm. A faint glow filled the room, soft, pale, and otherworldly. It emanated from the lantern in the center of the circle, growing brighter as Mallory stared. And then a voice. A child's voice, clear and cold. "You're too late." Mallory whipped around, her gun raised. Standing just beyond the circle of chairs was a figure, a small girl, her eyes wide and unblinking. Her face was gaunt, her skin pale and almost translucent. She wore a thin, white dress that fluttered despite the still air. "Mia?" Mallory asked, her voice cracking. The girl tilted her head, a ghostly smile tugging at her lips. "Don't you see?" she whispered. "It's already started." Part 8, the message. "Mia?" Mallory's voice wavered as she took a cautious step toward the girl. "Is that you?" The girl didn't answer. She tilted her head further, her smile widening as the pale glow from the lantern pulsed like a heartbeat. Mallory's grip on her gun tightened. Green stepped beside her, his flashlight trained on the child. "Detective, that's not—" "Mia, we're here to help," Mallory interrupted, ignoring the mounting tension in her chest. She knelt, her voice softening. "It's okay. You're safe now." The girl took a step closer, her bare feet making no sound on the damp floor. Her small hands reached toward Mallory, her smile unnerving in its stillness. Mallory's breath hitched as the girl's fingers grazed hers. "Cold. Too cold." And then the girl spoke, her voice soft but deliberate. "You can't stop it," she said. The lantern's light flared, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. Before Mallory could react, the girl's eyes rolled back, her head snapping upward as if something unseen had yanked her from within. She let out a piercing scream, her voice layered with others, deeper, older, like a chorus from the depths of something ancient. Mallory stumbled back, her gun trembling in her hand. "Mallory, move!" Green shouted, grabbing her arm and yanking her to her feet. The girl's scream abruptly stopped, replaced by a guttural growl. Her body convulsed, and she collapsed to the ground, motionless. The lantern shattered, plunging the room into total darkness. Mallory's ears rang as she scrambled to her feet, Green's grip steadying her. The only sound was their labored breathing, and the faint drip of water echoing through the tunnel. "Where is she?" Mallory hissed, her flashlight still refusing to work. Green swept his own beam across the room, but the girl was gone. The chairs were empty, their stuffed animals toppled to the floor. "She couldn't have just disappeared," Green muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Mallory's foot brushed against something. She crouched, her fingers finding the object in the darkness. It was a piece of paper, damp and wrinkled. She held it up to Green's flashlight. The note was written in the same jagged, childlike scrawl as the others. "He takes us because we belong to him. He's coming for you too." Below the message, a crude drawing depicted 5 stick figures in a circle, their arms outstretched toward a central figure, a towering shape with a hollow face and long, spindly arms. Mallory stared at the drawing, her chest tightening. This wasn't just about the children. "We're in his game now," she muttered, folding the paper and shoving it into her pocket. Green's flashlight flickered, and the rustling sound returned, this time louder and closer. "Detective," he said, his voice barely hiding his panic. "I hear it," Mallory snapped, raising her gun. From the tunnel behind them came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and heavy. Mallory turned toward the sound, her heart pounding. Her voice was steady, but her fear was raw. "Who's there?" The footsteps stopped. And then a voice. Deep. Inhuman. "You can't say them." Part 9. The Shape in the Dark. The inhuman voice echoed through the tunnel, bouncing off the damp walls and burrowing into Mallory's chest. Her pulse thudded, her breath coming in sharp bursts as the footsteps resumed, growing louder, heavier. Green's flashlight flickered again, casting frantic beams of light into the suffocating darkness. "Detective," he whispered, his voice trembling. "We need to move." Mallory didn't respond. Her focus was locked on the source of the sound, her gun raised, finger trembling on the trigger. Then it appeared. A shape at the far edge of the tunnel, just beyond the reach of their light. It was tall, unnaturally so, its body thin and angular, its movements jerky, as though it were learning to walk for the first time. "Light on it!" Mallory barked. Green's flashlight steadied, the beam landing squarely on the figure. Mallory's stomach churned. It had no face. Where a face should have been, there was only smooth, pale skin, stretched taut over a featureless surface. Its head tilted toward them, as though it could see despite its lack of eyes, and its spindly arms reached forward, each ending in long, claw-like fingers. Green stumbled back, his voice cracking. "What the hell is that?" The figure stepped closer, its limbs moving unnaturally, like a puppet on invisible strings. The sound of its feet on the damp ground was wet, deliberate, and impossibly loud. "Stay back!" Mallory shouted, her voice breaking. The figure stopped, its head tilting further, as if mocking her. Then it spoke. "I told you," it said, its voice a deep, guttural rasp. "You can't say them. They're mine." Mallory fired. The gunshot cracked through the tunnel, deafening in the confined space. The figure jerked as the bullet struck its chest, but instead of falling, it let out a deep, rattling laugh. Mallory fired again. And again. Each bullet found its mark, but the figure didn't falter. It only laughed, the sound reverberating with a hollow, otherworldly tone. Then it lunged. "Run!" Mallory screamed, grabbing Green and pulling him toward the tunnel entrance. They stumbled over the uneven ground, their flashlights bouncing wildly as the sound of the creature's pursuit filled the air. Heavy, deliberate steps, closing in faster than they could move. Green tripped, his flashlight clattering to the ground. Mallory spun, firing blindly into the darkness, as she hauled him to his feet. "Keep moving!" she shouted, her voice raw with desperation. The pale light of the tunnel entrance appeared ahead, faint but achingly close. Mallory pushed Green forward, her legs burning as she ran with every ounce of strength she had left. The footsteps stopped. Mallory skidded to a halt, spinning to face the darkness. The tunnel behind them was silent, the creature gone. Green collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. What was that?" Mallory didn't answer. Her hands were shaking, her mind racing. She didn't know what it was, but one thing was clear: whatever they were dealing with wasn't human. She looked back toward the tunnel, the oppressive silence weighing heavy on her chest. The game wasn't over. Not yet. Part 10. Threads of the Past. Mallory leaned against the cruiser, her hands trembling as she loaded another clip into her gun. Green stood nearby, pale and silent, his gaze locked on the tunnel entrance like it might spring to life again. "What did we just see?" Green muttered, more to himself than to her. Mallory didn't answer. Her mind was already elsewhere, piecing together the fragments of the case. The faceless figure. The list of names. The crude, childlike drawings. It all pointed to something orchestrated, deliberate, but by who? Or what? She pulled out her phone, scrolling through crime scene photos she'd saved. The Polaroid of the dark room filled with children's belongings. The scrawled messages. The list with its crossed-out names. Her eyes lingered on the drawing Jacob had handed her, the towering figure with the hollow face and jagged limbs, looming over the stick-figure children. This wasn't random. It wasn't just about the missing kids. This was something bigger. "Detective?" Green's voice jolted her from her thoughts. She looked up to see him holding a tablet, his fingers trembling as he turned the screen toward her. "You need to see this." The tablet displayed an old news article, its headline bold and ominous. 1989, 5 children vanished from Hemlock County, no trace found. Mallory took the tablet, scrolling through the article. The story detailed a chillingly similar case from over 30 years ago. 5 children had disappeared over the course of 6 months, leaving behind cryptic clues and unsettling scenes. Despite an exhaustive investigation, none of the children were ever found. The article included a grainy black and white photo of a group of detectives standing outside a familiar location, the tunnel Mallory had just fled. "That tunnel," Mallory said, her voice barely above a whisper. Green nodded. "It's the same one. The article says the kids used to play there before they disappeared." Mallory's eyes narrowed as she read further. The case had been officially closed in 1992, when the lead detective, a man named Walter Greaves, vanished without explanation. The final note in the file claimed he'd become obsessed with the case, convinced that the disappearances were tied to an ancient local legend. "What legend?" Mallory demanded, scrolling frantically. Green shrugged. "I couldn't find much. Something about a figure that takes children as payment for a deal made generations ago. They called it the Hollow Man." The name sent a shiver down Mallory's spine. "Where's the rest of the file?" she asked. "Archived," Green said. "But there's something else. Greaves left a journal, at least that's what the article says. His wife turned it over to the department after he disappeared. It might still be in evidence." Mallory straightened, adrenaline flooding her veins. "Then we're going to find it." Back at the precinct, Mallory tore through the dusty evidence storage room, boxes piled high with decades of unsolved crimes. Green sifted through files beside her, coughing as the thick air stirred with their movements. "Here," Mallory said, yanking a battered box from a shelf. The label read, "Greaves W. Missing Persons." She pried the box open, her heart pounding. Inside was a collection of yellowed papers, photographs, and at the bottom, a leather-bound journal. Mallory flipped it open, the pages filled with frantic, messy handwriting. Greaves's words spilled out like the ramblings of a man teetering on the edge of madness. "It's not just a story. The Hollow Man is real. He's been here for generations, taking what's owed. The children are his payment. They always have been." Mallory swallowed hard, reading further. "He chooses them, marks them. The games are just distractions. A way to make us think we have a chance to save them. But we don't. Once they're his forever." The last page was smeared with what looked like dried blood. "If you're reading this, it's already too late. He knows you're looking. He always knows." A cold chill seeped into the room. Mallory glanced at Green, whose face had gone pale. "We're next," he whispered. Mallory's phone buzzed. She answered with a trembling hand. "Detective Cain," came a panicked voice. It was Sarah. "You need to get to the Rogers house. Now." Part 11, The Mark. Mallory's car roared down the empty streets, Green in the passenger seat gripping the dash as they sped toward the Rogers house. The journal sat on the seat between them, its blood-smeared pages haunting Mallory like a whisper she couldn't unhear. Sarah didn't say much, Green muttered, his voice tight with tension. Just that it's urgent. It's always urgent, Mallory shot back, her eyes locked on the road. And it's always worse than we think. When they arrived, the Rogers house was bathed in the rotating lights of squad cars. Officers clustered near the front porch, their faces drawn and pale. Mallory jumped out, her badge flashing as she pushed through the crowd. Sarah! She called. Captain Sarah Ford turned, her usually composed face now creased with worry. Mallory, in here. Inside, the air was thick with dread. The living room was dimly lit, the curtains drawn tight. Mrs. Rogers sat on the couch, trembling, while her husband paced in frantic circles. It happened again, Sarah said, leading Mallory toward the stairs. What happened? See for yourself. Mia's bedroom was cold, the window open despite the freezing night air. Mallory's flashlight swept over the small space. Bright pink walls, stuffed animals lying neatly on a shelf, and a bed with a disheveled quilt thrown to one side. But it was the mirror that caught her attention. Words had been scrawled across its surface in what looked like blood. She's next. Beneath it was a drawing of the same figure from the notes and journal, the Hollow Man. Mallory swallowed hard and turned toward the corner of the room, where Sarah was standing. That's not all, Sarah said quietly. She pointed toward the nightstand. On the surface was a small doll, crudely made of cloth and twine, with a hollow circle drawn in red where the face should have been. A slip of paper was tucked under its arm. Mallory picked it up with shaking hands, unfolding it to reveal the same list she'd seen before. Mia Rogers X. Jacob Marner X. Kaylee Tan. Isaac Pierce X. Jenny Alvarez. The only difference now was the addition of a name at the very bottom, written in jagged letters. Mallory Cain. Her chest tightened, her grip on the paper unsteady. She felt Green's presence behind her before he spoke. Detective, he said, his voice barely audible. She turned, following his gaze. There, on the nape of Mia's pink-painted wall, was a fresh mark, a perfect, hollow circle with jagged lines radiating outward. Same as the tunnel, Green whispered. Mallory touched the mark with her gloved fingers, her mind racing. The journal's warnings rang in her ears. He marks them. The games are distractions. She turned sharply to Sarah. Where's Mia? She's at the hospital under protection, Sarah replied. We need to get there now, Mallory said, already moving toward the stairs. Why? Sarah called after her. Mallory paused, turning back with fire in her eyes. Because she's not safe. None of us are. Part 12, The Final Confrontation. The hospital was eerily quiet when Mallory and Green arrived. The long, sterile hallways glowed with pale, artificial light, and the faint hum of machinery filled the air. 2 officers stood guard outside Mia's room, their faces tense and pale. She hasn't moved, one of them said as Mallory approached. But something about this place feels off. Mallory nodded, her jaw tight. She pushed the door open, Green at her heels. Mia lay in the small hospital bed, her frame dwarfed by the blankets pulled up to her chin. Her eyes were open but unfocused, staring at the ceiling with a vacant, glassy expression. Mia, Mallory said softly, kneeling beside her. It's me, Detective Cain. Do you remember me? Mia didn't respond. She hasn't spoken since they brought her in, Green said quietly, standing near the foot of the bed. Mallory studied the girl, her heart aching. Mia's small hands clutched a ragged stuffed bear, and her lips moved faintly, as though whispering to someone only she could see. Mallory leaned closer, trying to catch the words. They float, Mia murmured, her voice thin and cracked. They float, around him. Mallory's stomach sank. A sudden chill swept through the room, and the overhead lights flickered. Mallory straightened, her hand instinctively moving to her gun. Mia, she said firmly, her voice cutting through the sudden tension. Who floats? Who are you talking about? The girl's vacant eyes finally shifted, locking onto Mallory's. A slow, unnatural smile spread across her face. "He's here," Mia whispered. The lights went out. The darkness was immediate and suffocating. Mallory's flashlight clicked on, the beam darting around the room as she heard Green curse behind her. "Mia!" Mallory called, spinning toward the bed. But it was empty. "Where is she?" Green demanded, his own flashlight jerking wildly across the walls. A faint, wet laugh echoed through the room. "Detective!" came the deep, guttural voice. Mallory froze. The beam of her flashlight landed on the corner of the room, and there it was, the Hollow Man. His smooth, featureless face seemed to glow faintly in the dark, and his long, spindly arms stretched toward her. "You came too close," he said, his voice resonating with malice. "You should have stayed away." "Where is Mia?" Mallory demanded, her voice sharp. The Hollow Man tilted his head, his body moving with a slow, unnatural grace. "She belongs to me now," he said. "Just as you will." Mallory fired. The bullets hit his chest, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he moved closer, his long limbs stretching like shadowy tendrils across the room. "Mallory!" Green shouted, his flashlight illuminating the mark now glowing on the wall, the same hollow circle with jagged lines. The air seemed to thicken, pressing down on Mallory, as the Hollow Man loomed over her. Her flashlight flickered, and in the brief moments of darkness, she saw flashes of the children, the missing ones, standing silently behind him, their faces pale and their eyes hollow. "Give her back!" Mallory growled, her voice trembling with rage. The Hollow Man's smooth face seemed to shift, twisting into a grotesque semblance of a smile. "You can't save them," he said. "But you can join them." A sudden burst of light filled the room as Green yanked the blankets from the bed, revealing another circle scrawled onto the sheets beneath it. "This is his anchor!" Green shouted. Mallory didn't hesitate. She grabbed a nearby lamp and smashed it against the circle, the glass shattering and scattering shards across the floor. The Hollow Man let out an ear-splitting shriek, his body convulsing as the children behind him flickered like dying flames. The pressure in the room lifted, and the glowing marks on the walls dimmed. The figure staggered back, his movements less confident, less controlled. "You can't stop me," he rasped, his voice weakening. Mallory raised her gun, leveling it at his smooth, hollow face. "Watch me." The shot rang out, and the Hollow Man dissolved into the shadows, his body unraveling like smoke in the wind. Mia reappeared seconds later, lying unconscious on the bed, her small hands still clutching the bear. The room fell silent, the oppressive atmosphere lifting as if a great weight had been removed. Mallory dropped to her knees, her gun slipping from her hand. Green placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice quiet. "It's over." Mallory shook her head, her eyes locked on Mia's sleeping form. "Not yet," she said. "There's always a next time." She stood, her gaze hard and unyielding. The Hollow Man was gone, for now. But she knew better than anyone that some shadows could never truly be erased. The end.
Thanks for listening. Subscribe, like, and don't miss the next scary stories. Bye-bye.